Even though the Biden presidency is still in its early days, peace activists have some suggestions on where Biden needs to focus in order to make a real difference. Joining us today to discuss where Biden needs to go to secure a peaceful future is Medea Benjamin. Medea is the co-founder of Global Exchange and CODEPINK, Women for Peace. She is the author of the 2018 book, Inside Iran, The Real History and Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Her previous books include Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection, Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, Don't Be Afraid, Gringo, a Honduran Woman Speaks from the Heart, and with Jody Evans, Stop the Next War Now, Inner Ocean Action Guide. You can follow Medea on Twitter at Medea Benjamin. Medea, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Hi, great to be on with you, Julianna.
Well, there's much to discuss, obviously, and I haven't heard a ton of discussion on, mainstream media about Biden's foreign policy. Let's start with the good news. You mentioned there are a few positive developments under Biden when it comes to foreign policy.
Well, sure, and a lot of that happened in the very beginning when he rejoined the Paris climate agreements. He rejoined he renewed the START treaty with Russia. He got us back into the World Health Organization. He lifted the Muslim ban. Those are all good things. And I would also say that on Afghanistan, it looks like even though he might not make the March 1st deadline for withdrawing troops, in fact, he probably most likely will not, at least they are moving forward with peace talks and getting the United Nations involved in that. So there are some good things, but there are some major problems, major disappointments that I wish would be discussed in the mainstream media. As you said, there's very little talk about foreign policy in general because there's so many issues domestically to deal with. But, the world goes on and continues to be harmed by U.S. policies.
What are the messes left on his plate by prior administrations?
Well, there are the sanctions that affect so many countries. I mean, Trump was just wild about sanctions. It's not a new thing for the U.S. to do. We used very cruel sanctions against Iraq back in the 90s that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. We've used sanctions against Iran in one form or another since the revolution there in 1979. But Trump really upped the ante and tighten the screws on the economies of countries like Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, North Korea. And let's remember now that in this last year, it's happened during a pandemic when countries are already reeling from the economic fallout of that, and they need money to import everything from the PPE to the vaccines and take care of their people who've lost their jobs. So it's particularly cruel. Biden inherited that and hasn't done anything to alleviate the situation, even though he talked about it.
I remember your recent book, Inside Iran. I remember us talking about that and how important it was to get an idea of what sanctions specifically do to people. Can you give us like a really tangible example of the sanctions and how they're affecting people's day-to-day lives?
They affect everybody because the price of food just soars. It doubles, it triples. Medicines become hard to find. And these are life-threatening diseases that people have, like cancer and diabetes. And now it's been very difficult for these countries to have the money they need to import the vaccines for COVID. Fuel is hard to get. Just imagine if suddenly your government had a fraction of the money that it was spending on social services. You lost your job because businesses can't stay open. There's a pandemic and you don't have oftentimes even basic electricity and fuel. So people's lives are very, very miserable. That's one thing that Biden inherited, and he's supposedly has a review underway about how these sanctions are affecting people during COVID. But this review's been going on, and meanwhile, we don't know when it's going to be done. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, and every day people are suffering the consequences of that.
What's happening with Biden's campaign promises of diplomacy?
Well, you certainly have to question what the heck happened when it came to Iran, because that was something that he inherited, Trump having pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. That was the great success of the Obama administration when Biden was vice president. And he talked about it during the campaign. We're going to get back into that Iran nuclear deal. And we expected that was going to happen right away. And here we are.
The climate
exactly.
The climate declaration. He went right back in there. Why do you think he hasn't just flipped Trump's flip on the Iran deal?
It really is a mystery why he is debating this so much, why he's let it get out of control, because it would have been so easy to do in the beginning. Now, in the meantime, the oppositional forces have become stronger, whether it's the Israelis or the Saudis overseas, or it's the anti-regime groups in the United States, the Iranian Americans, or it's the hawks in Congress, both Republicans as well as some very important Democrats like Senator Menendez, who is now head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Jewish lobby groups in the U.S., some of the conservative ones, because there are more liberal ones like J Street and Jewish Voice for Peace that are totally in favor of this. So as each day goes by, those groups become stronger, as well as the groups inside Iran who are saying, hey, why are we even going to bother with talking to the West? You make a deal with them, they don't agree with it. Then the guy who's coming back in says he was going to get back into it. He didn't. There was all this talk that we thought was going to happen, compliance for compliance. U.S. would go back into the deal. Iran would comply with the parts of the deal that they had gone out of compliance with because the U.S. had left the deal. So anyway, that has not happened. We're very worried about it and feel it's important to pressure the Biden administration to get back into that darn deal ASAP.
Are there any people involved with the administration of that deal who you have hope about?
Well, yes. In fact, the very envoy that was appointed by Biden, Rob Malley, is extremely good. He's a real diplomat. He was the head of the International Crisis Group. He understands how all sides in this. We were so excited when he was appointed. But yet then there are other people who've been appointed who are not eager to get into the deal. And so you have divisions within the administration itself. I would think that Biden himself would understand how he is making it harder and harder as each day goes by. But
do you think it's possible that Trump's closeness with different dictators around the world, his not really caring about the killing of the journalist Kamal Khashoggi, do you think that has something to do with the fact that Biden is not just quickly re-entering the deal?
Well, yes, it has a lot to do with domestic politics, but it's also about the politics in the region. And we had the Obama administration that was very close to the Saudis, even though he complained about them. He bragged about selling them over $100 billion in weapons. And during the end of the Obama years, he also did a terrible thing, which is to support the Saudis in their catastrophic war in Yemen. Trump got in. he continued that, got even closer to the Saudis, and he got even closer to the Israelis during his time. So all of that certainly weighs on Biden. But if we want to move towards the issue of the Saudis themselves, it's really interesting to see how Biden did something good there. Two things. One, he released the report by the intelligence agencies in the United States about the responsibility that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had for the murder of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Great, you released the report. We've been waiting for that. But then you're supposed to do something about it. Sanction the murderer, the Crown Prince. Freeze his assets in the United States. Say we will not go to any international meetings where he is present. They did nothing. Release the report, let the world know, and then just stopped.
Well, isn't that because we sell the military industrial complex, sells so many arms to Saudi Arabia that going against Saudi Arabia or even just going against MLB is going to cost the military industrial complex money?
Yes, and it's also that a lot of the Saudi money has been reinvested in the United States. So whether it's treasury bonds, Silicon Valley companies, real estate, they have so much money invested in the U.S. economy, and that gives them a lot of weight as well when it comes to talking about the U.S.-Saudi relations. So we have that situation, but then we also have the war in Yemen that Biden has said, this is terrible, we have to stop this. And he did something good, which is they paused the sale of weapons to the United Arab Emirates and offensive weapons to the Saudis. But then that left a lot of us, including members of Congress, wondering, well, what does that mean? What are offensive weapons versus defensive weapons? And is this pause just short-lived? And what other ways are you going to make sure that we're not giving any support to the Saudis for that war in Yemen? And
so you would think with his, ramping up Cold War with Russia and China, that it would be just fine to keep giving arms to the Saudis, because isn't that a proxy war between these countries there? Or have I misunderstood something?
Well, it is an internal war in Yemen that the Saudis then got involved with. And because of the Saudis being involved, then the Iranians got in on the other side. So in a sense, you could call it a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But really, it is an internal conflict that the Yemenis have to deal with themselves. And so Biden, even though he's been asked by members of Congress to explain what is really the U.S. situation in terms of Yemen, he was supposed to have given that report, and it hasn't come out yet. And then on top of that, there is this blockade that's being imposed by the Saudis and the Emiratis on Yemen, which is keeping fuel out, which means that food and medicines are difficult to get around the country. We, our coalitions and Congress, have asked the Biden administration to speak out and put pressure on the Saudis to end the blockade, and they haven't done that. In fact, the Biden envoy to Saudi Arabia, Tim Lenderking, actually denied to a CNN reporter that there even was a blockade. So we are, grateful that there are some efforts made to distance the U.S. from that war, but there's much more that has to be done.
In your article, you talked about the Biden administration conducting airstrikes in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and now they're shrouded in secrecy. There used to be a monthly publication, as you mentioned in your article, Air Power Summaries. It's been published since 2004, and Trump discontinued it a year ago, and Biden hasn't resurrected it. Talk about that.
Well, yes, we often focus, when there is a discussion about foreign policy, on the number of troops in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, but we don't talk about the airstrikes. And the airstrikes are the most devastating thing for the people on the ground and kill lots of civilians. Trump, in his last year, when he was negotiating with the Taliban for a peace agreement, stopped publishing the information about the airstrikes, because these were airstrikes in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. And now we thought the Biden administration coming back in, talking about transparency and international norms, would start publishing that information again. And they haven't done that. So we don't know how the airstrikes are continuing under Biden. And we know that there is a lot of talk about whether troops will be coming back. But if troops come back, but we continue on the airstrikes, we haven't ended these endless wars. So it's important to keep that in mind and to be pushing for transparency when it comes to the airstrikes.
You said that the military-industrial complex is counting on Biden to escalate a renewed Cold War with Russia and China. We spoke about this a little bit on the show with Professor Richard Wolff and the economics behind that. This seems like a very, very bad idea. Can you talk about, you said that these military budgets are setting the stage for World War III. Talk about the dynamic at play there.
Well, there is a Cold War already going on, and that is with Russia and with China. And it is the justification for continued bloated military budgets. And Biden is supposed to be coming out with his budget soon. We are putting pressure, the peace movement, as well as a number of members of Congress who've written to him and said, we need that money here at home. And we need to make significant cuts in the Pentagon budget. But the military, industrial, congressional, blah, blah, blah complex is always looking for an enemy. And what better enemy than these huge nuclear armed states? What better enemy than China? And we even saw during the campaign how Trump and Biden were vying with each other as to who could be more hard line when it came to talking particularly about the Chinese. So we are very concerned about this. It has so many repercussions, Juliana. We know it's got repercussions here at home with the anti-Asian hate sentiment that has led to so many new hate crimes and recent killings in Georgia, and affects the whole Asian American community. But we also know that it has tremendous impact on what weapon systems are made. And now the talk is that we need all these new high-tech weapons to be able to confront the Chinese. The Chinese are feeling the impact because of the U.S. warships are in the region saying, we will not let the Chinese control the South China Sea. It's called China Sea for a reason. And the U.S. has military bases surrounding China, and then with all of these verbal kinds of threats, as well as sanctions around trade issues, the Chinese are feeling the threat, and so they're increasing their military budget. And then the U.S., of course, turns around and says, "Look, the Chinese are increasing their budget." Of course, their budget is less than a third of ours, even with the increase, but it's used as justification to say, yes, we need to keep throwing money at these weapons at a time when the American people realize that the real threats that are facing us are not threats that weapons can do anything about. I mean, we're facing the threat of the pandemic and possibly future ones, and a healthcare system that doesn't work. We're facing the threat of the climate. We're facing the threat of extremist white nationalists, extreme inequality and racism in these countries. All of these issues have to be dealt with, and a lot of them need to be dealt with ongoing resources that are reallocated from the Pentagon into these other kinds of issues. And yet those who make their money from weapons and killing people, what the Pope calls the merchants of death, they want to keep us in a state of fear and be able to justify these staggering amounts of money that we throw down the black hole of the Pentagon.
You mentioned in the article something I thought was really interesting, that conversation between former President Jimmy Carter and Trump, where Jimmy Carter explained to Trump that over the last number of decades, China has been investing money in their infrastructure and lifting, 800 million people out of, did I get the number right? 800 million
no, I
people.
mean, it's astounding. I'm shaking my head because it is so amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, out of poverty, right? Lifting these people out of poverty by investing in infrastructure. And then that is just so interesting that we've just been continuing to invest in our military, and now we're going to force them to invest in their military because of our aggressive posturing, which means they're not going to be able to invest in as much infrastructure. President Biden is coming out with an infrastructure bill. Does that show at all, which is, the number is sizable, and even the reach outside of just bridges and tunnels and roads is rather far reaching. Does that signify some sort of change in policy? Seems like he's going to say, let's not upset the military industrial complex. Let's do a lot of infrastructure. You know what I mean?
Yes. I think it's great to invest this money in infrastructure in the United States. And there is talk in the administration where they say, well, we don't like this Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese, which is since 2013, they've been building massive infrastructure projects around the world to connect China to places all over the world and to help facilitate transport within different countries. It's been a win-win in the most part. There have been some that have been some boondoggles that have created environmental disasters, but for the most part, it's been positive. And the U.S. is now, there are people in the Biden administration saying, well, maybe we need to do something like that. Help people in other parts of the world instead of invading them, occupying them.
I can't believe it took this long to dawn on them. It's like China had to do it first before.
The U.S. can't really do it right now because we have so many needs here at home. But they are recognizing to some extent that the Chinese are beating us by this economic investment. Yet, as you say, I don't think Biden is ready to redirect significant amounts of military money. You look at it's just too big. The U.S. has over 800 bases around the world. China has 3. You think Biden is going to start closing hundreds of bases? It's something we're working for. It's something we in the peace movement really want, but don't see it happening. The U.S. continues to build these huge aircraft carriers, huge, enormous things with enormous investments. Are they going to stop building them? No, because it's jobs. The U.S. now is based on a war economy. And it's kind of like that ship that's in the Suez Canal that's blocking everything. The whole thing has to be moved, totally turned. We have to have a different kind of economy that's not based on building weapons of destruction. And that's going to take a lot to do. And talking about weapons of destruction, there's also the nuclear weapon issue that under Obama, there was a plan to invest over $1 trillion in the next 30 years to modernize our nuclear weapons at a time when the world now just passed a new treaty at the UN to ban nuclear weapons. So, we've got to take our country back from the military industrial complex. We've got to say, $1 trillion invested in nuclear weapons is just insane right now. Let's take that money and invest it in real needs.
How do you think, what are the steps to get there in terms of taking back our money and our they're so profitable. It's not like they're going to give up power without a fight, and they have all the weapons.
Well, the positive thing now is that we do have allies in Congress. There is even a new caucus called the Pentagon, the Military Spending Reduction Caucus. There were 93 members of the House that voted last year to cut the military budget by 10%, and we're trying to get more of them this year to call for that. And so there's a new understanding among lots of organizations that wouldn't call themselves particularly peace groups, but are people's groups like the Poor People's Campaign, the Movement for Black Lives, A lot of these groups that are with us in this call for reducing Pentagon spending, the group Public Citizen, that has hundreds of thousands of members, is really leading a campaign calling for reduction in Pentagon spending. So there's a lot of energy out there. It's not going to happen in this term. The best that we can look for is no increases in Pentagon spending, but there is momentum, and I think that momentum will only build as the past due comes for all the money that we are spending now on the relief packages, on the infrastructure bill. We're going to have to find ways to save money and redirect that money, and that has to be through the Pentagon, because that's the big pot of gold that every year we keep spending over half of our discretionary funds on the Pentagon. So I'm hopeful that it will happen. It just won't be quick enough, or it won't be big enough, but it will start to happen.
Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Global Exchange and CODEPINK Women for Peace. It's always incredibly enlightening when I have you on the program. So thank you for being here with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And if people can go to CODEPINK and sign up and help us build this movement to redirect our government, our economy, our foreign policy towards peaceful ends. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Follow Medea Benjamin on Twitter at MEDEA Benjamin, BENJAMIN, or CODEPINK. Pretty obvious how to spell that. You're watching ACT TV. Thanks for watching.